So welcome back to the next section, and let's use Gartner again because they're so pivotal to how our supply chain leaders think about, what's happening in the market and the trends. So according to Gartner, 74% of supply chain leaders say they're modernizing systems, but yet only 23% say they're seeing real business model innovation. Let's be clear, the gap isn't technology, it's transformation. In this final section, we explore how enterprises can bridge the gap between traditional operations and modern innovation using supply chain as a proving ground. So, Eric, welcome back. So here's the quick question to get us warmed up again. So why do traditional companies struggle to innovate, even when they have modern technical stacks?
Oh, well, it was going to be an easy question until no, it's going to be a hard question until you added that last bit about technical stacks. And if I can borrow a quote from an extremely brilliant person, is that if it were just about the technology, we would have solved it 30 years ago because we're still working on the same technical problems we were 30 years ago. It was John who said that. Um, um, I think that the real problem with transformation is that we don't there are two things: we don't know how to transform very well, and secondly is we're still not being customer obsessed in how we transform. So we're thinking about how do we solve demand management problems without really understanding why we're solving the demand management problems. So we solve the demand management problems, but they don't actually solve any real pain point. So as a result, it all kind of fizzles out. So I think the first major suggestion I would give to enterprises is think about it. Now, I don't mean that you should suddenly become a customer obsessed organization. I don't, that's a major change, and I don't think you need to do that. But you need to integrate more customer obsessed ideas into the way that you execute your strategies so that the end result is that you're actually building things that people want. So I would say one is start to adopt customer driven mechanisms or processes like working backwards toolkit that begin to help to make sure that you're building the right things, not just building things right, which I think is what our world has suffered from for the last 50 years, is that a focus on, I can't imagine how many amazing project management tools and change management tools are out there, and none of which works. We know because we're sitting here today complaining about the fact that nothing works. With transformation, I would also say is, stop. Like, we know it doesn't work. Like PMBOK, ADCAR, change management. We know it doesn't work. So let's stop banging our heads against the wall and doing things in the exact same way over and over and over again. I think it's time to rethink how we execute change, how we think and execute about transformation. It's time to actually go ahead and try new things. I wouldn't just follow the same standards that are in place because we know that they don't work.
There's a famous quote is there from someone relatively more intelligent than I about doing the same things and expecting different outcomes. We can drive on. I mean, one of the things that I always find really interesting in that space as well, when we talk about modern tech stacks, it's a bit like a really wealthy person going and buying a Formula One car and then going to the Nuremberg track. Just because you have the tools doesn't mean that you actually know how to use them or have the right sort of tool for the job that you're doing, because actually you may have just needed the best tool to go shopping and not to go racing. So I often really worry sometimes that a lot of customers that we speak to, they spend an absolute fortune on buying best of breed everything. Then you'll hear the comment, right? If it's not the top right quadrant of Gartner, I'm not interested. Failing to recognize that maybe some of those positions are paid to play positions. But anyways, parking that to one side. So if it's not the top right quadrant, I'm not buying it. Great. But what you're going to always end up with is doing the same old stuff that everybody else is doing and then complaining about why it is that it's not working. So I suppose what we maybe can do is we can take a look at Amazon, and we don't believe that Amazon is the best in breed of everything or best of class of everything, and nor do we think that all of the stuff that Amazon does is 100% applicable to every other type of business. But when we think about Amazon, we often think about, high velocity, and whether we're talking about Amazon.com and its ability to deliver, we think about the technology that it uses to deliver, whether it's robots in the warehouse, route optimization for the vehicles. If we think about AWS, then again we're thinking about, the latest chipsets in the data centers. We're thinking about how AI, ML, and the agentic AI revolution, and all of these things are just going across the world at speed and scale. So maybe you can help us find a couple of lessons that people maybe should pay attention to from companies like Amazon, whenever they are thinking about this whole idea of how do you innovate.
Yeah. I think I would call out two things that again, I think there are companies that might do change better than Amazon, but there are certainly two things that I took from my experience there, which I think I would call best practice. One is that, um, all those examples you mentioned feel like really big changes, right? The development of AI and development of AWS at all, um, and that's fine. That's the way the press will portray it. But the reality is that Amazon is not as disruptive as you might think. It is disruptive in its thinking, but it's quite incremental in its execution. And so we would write, let's say, in fact, there was a press release for Amazon Web Services, for example. Um, um, but once the press release is written, the next few years is a series of pivots, of incremental pivots. So we build out something small, we experiment on it, we see what the results are, and then we make honest, challenging decisions about pivot and persevere. And sometimes many times businesses will simply be killed once the evidence shows that we're going down the wrong route. In fact, I would say that that's one of Amazon's core competencies, is being able to kill things fast and not being afraid to say, yeah, we're going to kill it. Um, so actually change is very incremental. It feels like it's a big bang approach. So, you feel like, oh, there's a 120 million 3-year budget, but that doesn't exist in Amazon. Rarely that kind of, it will exist for data centers, but other than that, it's a rare case. Really what you're looking at is it's a 120 million 3-year plan that's broken down into the first 3 months. And what do we need to do to demonstrate traction in 3 months? If we demonstrate traction in 3 months, we get funding for another 3 months. And what do we demonstrate traction at that point, right? So everything is done in phases, in tranches, and funding is kind of tied to that. I mean, it's not a perfect process, but what the one of the weird things you'll find about is how like headcount funding is done. In most companies, you get an annual process and you get a set of headcount at the beginning of the year, and that's what you live with. And at Amazon, there's multiple points where you can go back and forth depending on what traction you've made against your plan, against your hypothesis, essentially, right? You're coming up with a business hypothesis and then you're proving it out. So I think that one is super cool, is this idea of thinking big and it's simultaneously executing small. That's super cool at Amazon. The other one I think that is interesting, I mentioned before that I think we all need to rethink how we think about change. And one really interesting idea that I was executing at Amazon is this idea that we should throw out all of the change management approaches that we've been working on and instead replace them with Crossing the Chasm by Jeffrey Moore. And if you think, that book basically looks at product adoption life cycle, and it says that throughout a lifetime, a product will basically go through different phases, and it starts off with innovators and early adopters, it goes to early majority, then it comes to the top and late majority, and eventually laggards. And the area under the curve are the people that we're selling to. And so in Crossing the Chasm, Jeffrey Moore is really interested in this idea of how do you go from early adopters to early majority, because what he finds is that those two buying categories, they think very, very differently. So if I'm successful at selling to the early adopter, there's this big risk that I continue that same approach when I try to sell to the early majority, but the early majority doesn't buy the way the early adopters buy. So that will be a huge failure. And that's the chasm that you fall down, because you're not able to change your positioning to, to, to meet the needs of these different markets. And then in the book, he gives you all sorts of amazing best practices on how do you market and sell and roll out to these different categories of buyers. If you just think about the market as your internal employee base and the product you're selling as your transformation program, then all this is a product adoption lifecycle problem, where we have the product adoption lifecycle process, which has already been defined for us. We know it works. It's been working for hundreds of years. We have so much evidence and data that it works, and it does work. And so maybe let's throw out all of our change management models, which we know don't work because we've been trying, we get leadership buy-in, get a quick win, all these things. Well, it sounds good, and we certainly have funded McKinsey's growth for the last 30 years in this, but we know it doesn't work. It fails almost every time. So let's bite the bullet and say, hey, it doesn't work. Let's get rid of it, even though we've invested hundreds of millions of dollars into it. Too bad, it doesn't work. So maybe consider adopting a product adoption lifecycle model and applying it to change management. That one, I think, is idea number 2, which is absolutely killer, because change management models don't work.
I do, it's a cultural thing actually that's a bit odd when you walk into some traditional businesses, because that's the sort of mindset that you arrive with, having had the experience of Amazon and the experience of helping other companies adopt this sort of approach, and then you sort of feel this tension when you're attempting to speak in a different language and attempting to drive innovation in a different language. Yeah, a funny example is that we created a traceability product for a multi-billion-dollar oil and gas company, and the feedback that we got from the users was intuitive, don't need any formal training. We had a guy that picked it up, in under 10 minutes, having never seen the tool before, because they knew exactly what to do with it. And it changed, the company we're talking to is afterwards, and they were saying, guys, we've never seen this before. We were expecting you to come, with a formal training program, with all the PDFs in multiple languages, with a train the trainer business, with in other words, they were expecting another, insert multi-100,000 pound follow-up offer to come and conduct training, when actually we were saying was, right, we've invested all the training up front because we've learned from you, we've listened to you, we've adjusted the UI with you, we've embedded any lessons that people need to follow into the UI, so that you don't need formal training. Now drive on.
Imagine if you go the old route and you say, okay, we're going to buy the licenses of the product, we're going to roll it out, we're going to roll out training, all of it together is going to be a 2-year process. Maybe it's 15 mil pounds or something like that. And suppose 1 year into that, the customers come back and say, I don't need traceability the way that you're doing it. I need a different form of traceability. Oh
Yeah.
my God, you're screwed. Right? You're halfway in. So you don't want to, fallacy of sunk costs. You don't want to stop halfway, even no matter who's telling you. It's like, no, we can't do this. We've already invested 75 million into this, and then so it's gonna become a zombie program. You're just gonna keep investing it, even though it's dead. You're gonna keep investing in it. Holy smokes! That's the fundamental reason why we need working backwards toolkit, to prevent us. So have the process stop you from making those silly decisions.
So you've just scratched into the next area I wanted to talk about, right? Which is really good. It's as if we rehearsed this, Eric. So when I mentioned oil and gas, that's one sector that is asset heavy, but it's also heavily regulated. And there are many large traditional manufacturers who they have to think long term, right? They're buying equipment maybe once in a generation, and they need to sweat that asset for many years to see any sort of return on the kit. And in some ways, a lot of these heavily regulated businesses also have to comply with complex policies from governments or other regulators. So in these environments, I suppose I see lots of challenges. Right, when we talk about innovation in in these businesses, they they look to people like Amazon. They look to asset light organizations, and they think, well, of course you can pick your stuff up and turn to the right and go and spend money in a different direction. We can't. We're fixed. We're an aluminium manufacturer. We've invested, countless numbers of thousands of pounds in making the greener aluminum as you can make, but we're fixed. We've got this sort of aspect. So how do we balance, the sort of the notion of innovation with, can I call it operational discipline? That sort of really structured ways of working, so that you can still innovate within heavily regulated industries.
So I kind of it's been a while since I was doing the EBC circuit, but one of the stories about Amazon, which is super cool, is the number of changes to production that they make every day. I think it's on the order of like every 2.3 seconds there's a production change somewhere in Amazon, meaning there's a change to the production environment. And most businesses will say, oh my god, you can never do that, because if production goes down, it's somebody's job, it's somebody's neck, right? And so they say, okay, instead let's only do changes once every quarter, and we'll put in place this really disciplined process over a 3-day period, maybe a 3-day weekend holiday, business holiday. Let's bring everyone in, and let's implement this really big change with lots and lots of controls to make sure everything is okay. And now, if you've ever done those kind of change processes, you know how painful those are, because here's the thing is, if you save up all your changes to deploy at one time, there's a huge risk that one of those changes is faulty, and and when you have so many of them at the same time, it's really hard to figure out which one is faulty. And so you deploy, and most of the time the whole thing crashes because of some problem, and then you have to unwind everything you've done and figure out what's the problem, go fix the problem, then come back, and oh my goodness, it could be a million lines of code that you're dealing with, right? So Amazon says, no, if I make one line of HTML change, I'm going to push that out directly to production. Why? Well, one, I think it's very unlikely that there's a mistake, because I'm only pushing out 20 characters. So I can trust my engineering team, that they're not going to make a mistake on something so simple, because it's easy to see. But if there is a problem, no issue. We can roll back. It's easy to roll back one line of code because there are no dependencies, everything is there. And so we can be sure that a rollback can be done within seconds if there really is a problem. And then discovering what the bug is, very easy with one line of code. When you're deploying simple things very quickly, and you have a good rollout mechanism to do pre-testing and whatever else is, the amazing thing is you end up with less downtime than if you treat this as a critical ritual in your business, and you make it a big deal, and you save up all your changes, and you implement 1,000 controls. You have 50 people staying up over the weekend with no sleep at nights, and stress and beepers and all the pagers and all the rest of this stuff, right? So it turns out that if you think about, if you actually, instead of increasing controls, if you can reduce risk instead. So reduce the risk of your activity. Instead of improving the controls that monitor that activity, you can get way better results. Unintuitively too. Like, it's weird. Like, because I come from the Sarbanes-Oxley, SOX background. I have, don't change production tattooed on my right shoulder, right? So, you should never do that. You should never make big changes to your, or you should never make change. And Amazon just says, no, you should make change constantly. And in fact, when you do it that way, you are more resilient, which seems weird.
Maybe no, it seems weird, but the way that you describe it helps make it logical. And it does help, because I remember running fulfillment centers, where you would be making small incremental changes, And sometimes you need to be able to do them rapidly, not wait for a big code change. I give you an example. We made a mistake, or I made a mistake, where we hadn't logged um, the correct postal address. I don't mean, something as fundamental as we've got the wrong. I mean, where the front gate was, to the 1 meter square resolution, correctly in the system, which basically meant we had trucks being routed to the wrong gate for the fulfillment center, which is okay if you're only receiving a couple of trucks every now and again, but when you're receiving many hundreds of trucks, propagating the error through this system. So it was something that we spotted. It was something that we were able to fix, and it was something we were able to do incrementally rather than waiting for some batch job. Had we had to wait for a batch job, then the local police would have been even more upset with us, as they would have had thousands of trucks queuing the wrong way around the roundabout to get into the facility. So maybe one other area then that we could reflect on is this term, modern, which I think is a good throwaway term. It's almost like innovative. But when we talk about modern and we're thinking about things like fulfillment centers, asset utilization, inventory visit, what is it actually? What is a modern business model? What does it look like? What is it?
I don't know. I don't think, I'm not sure I use modern in thinking about business models that I play with. But what I would say is that business models evolve. So obviously we didn't have e-commerce at some point, and then we did, right? So you could say that modern is simply business models that are taking advantage of all of the opportunities that have developed either technologically or geopolitically, or in terms of customer expectations. So for example, if I were to define modern the way I think about it, one of the big aspects of modern today is customer experience. And all customers expect you as a baseline to be the Apple UI. If you're not as simple and fun to use as my existing products, then we have a problem, right? So modern. There's an expectation of really seamless, fun, and user experience, for example, right? So I would say modern should be a delightful experience for a customer. And I think obviously, we have generative and agentic AI that is becoming more and more part of our day-to-day work. That's a new technological impact. So now modern would have to integrate or leverage the capabilities of either generative or agentic AI. So I think modern has to be, the user experience needs to be at the level of my consumer experience, even in a B2B context, and it needs to be leveraging AI.
I think it's good. I mean, I'm sorry for putting you on the spot with a generic word like modern, because I think it's just something that I hear bandied around a lot. But yet it's again, is it defined in the English dictionary? Yes. Do we actually know what it means? No.
Yeah, I think if I had looked, especially in supply chain, if you had asked me like 8 years ago, the answer would be different, right? Because then it's integrative. It needs to be real time. It needs to be API driven or automated, right? But but now I think if I were to say modern within the supply chain industry, I would, the bar is raised. Like, I'm not sure API driven shouldn't be a hygiene feature at this point.
You mean you'd love to think so? When I reflect upon modern and how our supply chain wise is thinking about modern in the supply chain, why do you have to log into a demand planning tool to ask it what the performance is of a particular product set? Right. In fact, what I want is, I want my demand planning agent in my team calls with me. I want to be able to ask intelligent questions of the demand planning agent, and I want the agent to be able to go off, not only internally, but also externally, to be able to bring together the right sets of data with the right decision making, and to help me make better informed decisions. So
Yeah.
ultimately, several years ago, we would have been talking about, as you rightly said, loosely coupled API generated supply chains. Today, no. Today I want agents. I want to interact with
Yeah.
agents, and I want to be able to coordinate. But the problem with all of that is that that's still many, many steps away from where a lot of companies sit. A lot of companies still, they struggle with knowing what they know, meaning their data is poor. They could have 5 different names for the same SKU, depending upon which company, which SAP version they're using, which country that they're operating across, and even down to which shipment they're using.
Yeah.
But I think you nailed the key message though, which is that modern doesn't mean digital just for the sake of it. Yeah, I mean, I think Eric, I think you absolutely nailed it. When we think about modern, it's not just technology for the sake of it. To me, modern it's a culture. It's a means. It means mechanisms. It's about vision, and it's still about courage. And it's about applying those to not the easy fixes, but to the hardest parts of the business. Eric, thank you. It's been absolutely brilliant. And thank you for sharing so much time with us. And for those that are watching, maybe you could put in the comments about which Amazon principles, you are going to bring into your business next. And if you've enjoyed the sorts of things that we've been talking about, then please do feel free to log in and watch some additional videos around ERP and other aspects of data that we've been talking about. And do hit the like and subscribe, because it does make it easier for us to be able to continue making great content with great speakers like Eric. Thank you.